Good afternoon, everybody. Once again, please join us. And remember, the hashtag is hashtag EFF Book Club. My name is Umpile Maotwe, and I'm the Treasurer General of the Economic Freedom Fighters. I will be taking you through 23 things that they don't tell you about capitalism. So, first of all, the book was written by Professor Chang, originally born in South Korea, but currently living in the UK as a lecturer. Professor Chang penned down this book in 2010, immediately after the 2008 financial crisis. Basically, what he tells, the introduction of the book says that the book was necessitated by the 2008 financial crisis, and he termed the financial crisis as the second largest financial crisis in the world after the Great Depression. We know what happened during the Great Depression. It was the financial crisis again, which started back in 1929 and lasted for almost a decade. It was really started by a crash, which then sent panic to the Wall Street, and then we saw billions of rands being lost from that. And it left many families and people unemployed. People lost their houses, people lost their cars, their belongings, and people who then went bankrupt, they were unable to make it back into the economic mainstream again. And that is the cruelty of the financial system that is led by capitalism. So we are going to be, the first key concept that I want us to deal with is what exactly is capitalism and what is free market capitalism, because in his book he writes mainly about free market capitalism. So capitalism is a political and economic system where the means of production are in private hands. So basically, the owners of the means of production are private people. And the free market capitalism refers to a system where the price of goods and services is self-regulated by the market and consumers. And in that case, there's very little, if not no intervention at all from government. Now, he kickstarted the book by saying that the global economy lies in tatters since 2008. And he says this because after the 2008 financial crisis, we saw governments then cutting down budget, which then led to the less investments being put in place, and also that system then affecting the welfare system and leading to the economy not being able to grow or to stagnate completely. So the first point that he makes is about 23 things that I'll be taking through. And the first point that he makes is that there's no such thing as a free market. Well, capitalists will tell you that the free marketers must be left alone. We've been told that they know what they're doing, and they are the ones who create jobs. They are the ones who brings about technology, and they are the ones who knows how to produce goods and services, and therefore they must be left alone because they know what they're doing. If there's any intervention from government, it will only lead to the less incentive of those that are rich, and therefore government must not intervene. But the reality is that if government does not intervene, we are going to find a situation where there's issues of child labor, there's no protection of workers, there's no basic conditions of employment act that are protecting the workers, and therefore the argument that is putting on the table is that you therefore cannot leave the market to be free from intervention by government, because government will bring issues of, for example, training, which normally the capitalists, they don't want to invest in training because their main aim is to maximize the profits. So in the maximization of profit, they overlook the long-term investments of the company because they need to make money, and they must make money now. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that the argument is that companies must be run in the interest of shareholders. Now, shareholders are owners of the companies, and the capitalists will argue that, well, shareholders don't have the same privilege or the same advantage as employees, because employees, when you enter into a company, there's a contract that you sign with the organization, with the company, that says you're going to do this and I'm going to pay you this much. The same applies to service providers. When the service provider is providing a good or a service to the company, then there's a contract that gets signed, and therefore anything that happens, that service provider will be paid the money, and the stakeholders don't have that luxury. So therefore they depend on dividends, which comes through when the organization or the company is doing well in terms of the profit. So they have to maximize profit because they need then to get dividends, which will then go to the shareholders. But the reality is that those shareholders, they don't have interest in the long term sustainability of the company. So what they focus on is basically, we want to make money, we want to get rich, and we must get rich now, because we are not sure if in the next 5 years there will be a new government which will come with the laws that will then prohibit us from operating or even take some measures from us. And therefore, the whole idea of capitalism really is to make money, irrespective of what happens, whether it's to exploit workers or to not to invest in the workers. Their main objective really is to make money. The third point is they argue that, the capitalists will argue that in a free market, people get paid according to their productivity, and therefore people that get paid, particularly in rich countries, are because they are more productive than the others. But that is not true, because a rock driller here in Lonmin in Matakana is doing the exact same job in the same company which has got a mine in Australia or anywhere else, and they're getting paid far much less than those people that work in rich countries. And the sad part is, you will find that because this company is an international company and it's got operations and mines here in the country, they don't invest in equipment and machinery, and therefore the rock driller here in South Africa could be doing a much more labor-intensive activity in drilling, rather than the person who is then in Australia on the same. So there's double disadvantage of the workers here. Firstly is that they do more intensive labor-intensive work, and they get paid less, and the person who is doing the exact same job in rich countries is using machinery, is just sitting and directing a machine to say drill here, drill there. Another argument that you can put on the table is that a bus driver, for example, why must a bus driver here in South Africa be paid far much less than the bus driver in the US, when here firstly the roads might not be that good, and the roads in the US might be good, yet you are told that there's productivity. So there's no productivity in driving. You can't tell me that the driver in South Africa is less productive than the driver in the US, even though they drive the same number of hours, and possibly they drive the same number of kilometers in a day. And therefore that argument cannot stand. What needs to happen is that the wage gap between the rich and the poor is existing because of immigration rules. They know that if they were to pay the same money that they are paying to these people, then and they loosen up the immigration controls, the workforce in the rich countries will be taken over by the majority of the people who come from poor countries. So they are trying to protect their workforce by putting these immigration controls in place. Number 4, he's arguing that the internet is not necessarily the revolutionary technology that exists today. He argues and says that the capitalists will make you believe that a new innovation is changing the world in the way the world operates, and they will tend to forget and put a blind eye on those innovations that were brought before that technology. We all agree that the internet, yes, they've brought about a certain level of disruption into the system, but that does not mean that it is the only thing. And then he makes an example with household appliances, and he says, in the past, if you were to iron your clothes in the absence of electricity and electrical iron, you'll have to go fetch wood from the bush and then come and make the fire, keep the fire burning, and then that fire will then heat the iron, and that iron will eventually become hot, and then you iron. So the number of hours that you put in that activity is far much longer than the innovation of bringing about now an electric iron, which you then can iron and finish ironing within a short period of time. So what has that done? That has drastically reduced professions like domestic work, particularly in rich countries. They've got less domestic workers because now they've got electric iron, they've got the washing machine, they've got the electrical hoovers. So while you're busy putting the laundry in the machine, you could be cleaning your house, and that activity is finished within an hour, and therefore you can go and do other productive issues. So his argument is that the capitalist will make you believe that a new innovation basically is the best thing that's ever happened, and make you forget about other innovations that were put in place. And the fifth point he's making is that the capitalists, they believe that people are the worst. And when you believe that people are the worst, you are going to get the worst out of people. And how you see that system, it's happening everywhere. I mean, if you're a poor person and you go to a rich, a suburban mall, I mean, there's cameras everywhere. And those cameras are not put for rich people. Those cameras are put for poor people. So that's an illustration to say a poor person is automatically a suspect. I mean, you've got rich people living in high-walled houses with electric fences, and that's an illustration of a system that is suspicious to poor people. But the reality is that people are not born criminals. People are created to be criminals because of the system. The socio-economic conditions of any country will then dictate how people behave and how people perform. So the capitalist system thinks the worst of people, even though we know that that is not the worst. And they will argue that that is why communism failed, because communism assumed that everybody is selfless. We've got selfless people in this world. The only thing is that people are not born criminals. People are made criminals by the system. And therefore, if you were to change the living conditions of these people, the people will, you'll get the best out of people. And number 6, it says the greater macroeconomic economies, they have not brought about stability. Now they want to argue and say inflation is the enemy that is creating the economy not to grow. But the reality is that inflation is not, because it can be tamed. Therefore, inflation can be the enemy. The enemy is job insecurity. The enemy is the high unemployment rate, which leads to the greatest levels of inequality. And how is that happening? So when you've got a country with high unemployment rate, basically what it means is that you've got less economic activities. And because you've got less economic activities, that then translates directly into the stagnation or the slower growth of the economy. Because in the absence of economic activities, how then do you stimulate the economy? You can't. For you to stimulate the economy and to grow the economy, you've got to have an active economic system where people are employed. So inflation is not the enemy. The enemy is job insecurity. And you must not be fooled by the capitalists. Now, the 7th point that he's making is that the free market economy barely makes poor countries rich. Now, the rich will argue that poor countries, even after their independence, they still remain poor because they want to adopt policies of things that they don't understand, things like state ownership of banks and other strategic sectors of the economy. They want to, and they don't have capacity and the expertise to run those state-owned entities, and therefore those complicated things must be left to the clever ones, which are the capitalists who have run anyway these economies, and they were colonizers before. Therefore, the poor countries after independence, they must not become clever. But the reality is that majority of these, if not all, these rich countries, they were made rich through interventions by government. So in the absence of government intervention, these rich countries could not have been what they are today. So the rich countries will continue to grow, and the poor countries will remain poor because of the free market policies and nothing else. It's not about the government. It's not about the expertise of the officials of government. It is because of the free market policies that they bring about. And how you see this happening is that if they are scared, because if they were to leave Africa to decide its path and do away with free market capitalist policies, they know that Africa will develop and they know that Africa will grow. Number 8, the argument is that capital has a nationality. So here he's arguing that the multinational companies, which obviously they've got a country of origin, and they pretend to everybody that they've got facilities and factories in other parts of the country, and therefore because of that they are the champions of globalization, and with that globalization then they are the ones who are making the economies to grow. But the reality of the matter is that these multinational companies, they are loyal and they remain loyal to their home countries. Take an example of any of the multinational companies that you may know. The top leadership of that company remains in the home country. Key decisions that gets entered into remain in those countries. Even if you enter into a contract, that contract will be signed in that home country. We've got a West African country called Nigeria that entered into a contract with a US company to build equipment, 100 equipments. One equipment is not worth less than 50 million. Now the question is, this equipment is built to last for 15 to 20 years. And why is this multinational company, why did they not manufacture this equipment here in Nigeria? And if you look at most of these multinational companies, majority or the bulk of their market share is Africa, but none of them is establishing a factory or a workshop in Africa. Why? Because they need to benefit the home countries. They are too loyal. Even if they were to open that factory will be the first one to be closed even before they can close the factory in their home countries. So what happened with that Nigeria transaction is that the government entered into this contract to build 100 equipment that is meant to last for 15 to 20 years. That equipment was shipped into Nigeria as a complete product. Why was it not manufactured in Nigeria if the argument must end? That's one. 2, they know that for that equipment to last the 15 and 20 years that is meant to last, it needs high standard of maintenance regime that the Nigerians need to adhere to. Now the question is, if that equipment fails in the 3 years of its contract, what happens? They will not come and fix it, because why? They will have 100 reasons of why they can't do it, because you did not manufacture it according to the agreed spec. So therefore, the multinational companies remain indebted to their home countries. And when we have to look also at the research and development of those multinational companies, it's not done in poor countries, it's done in their home country. So therefore, they are not loyal to anybody except their home countries. And the bulk of the benefits goes to their home countries. Number 9 says they want us to believe that we live in a post-industrial age, because they believe, the capitalists, they believe that manufacturing has come to a complete decline. Now, the reality is that all these rich countries were made rich because of manufacturing, industrialization. Now, if they want us to believe that manufacturing has stopped, they must tell us today who is manufacturing teaspoons, a simple teaspoon, a cutlery that is being used by anybody. So as people grow, you are born 3, 4 in the family. In a period of 12 to 25 years, you leave the family and you go and start your own family. Who is producing teaspoon for you? So they want you to believe that no, don't enter into the manufacturing sector. The world has changed. We are now talking knowledge-based services, like those services of the bank and management consulting, and that's what you need to focus on. And they will bring softwares and the framework from rich countries to come and impose them here. And even their consultants will be the consultants that they bring, and they come and do the consulting here. So why they do that? They do that so that they can remain in control, they can remain in charge of those countries. So there is no country that can grow the economy without manufacturing. If you look at the countries that are performing well to date, your Switzerland, your Japan, your Singapore, those remains countries that have industrialized, and they continue to industrialize. Manufacturing can never stop. The place that you eat, the glass that you drink water with, those glass gets broken every day, and they get bought, and as you build families. So we must never be fooled to believe that we live in a post-industrial age, because now all of a sudden we must then look into knowledge-based services. So yes, we agree, we must move with technology, we must go into knowledge-based services, but equally the driving force of the growth of the economy is and remains manufacturing. Number 10, the argument there is that the US, they continue to live higher standard of living in the world. So the capitalists will come and say, look, despite the 2008 financial crisis, the US remains on top because they've got a system that is able to fight any crisis. And they will argue that the dollar equivalent, if you go and purchase goods and services anywhere in the world, there will be few goods and services that you can purchase. But if you're in the US, you'll have more goods and services that you can purchase. But that argument cannot hold because, one, in the US there's a lot of immigrants, and they use those immigrants to produce goods and services at a cheaper rate because they don't have the strict employment conditions as particularly the rich, the poor countries. So issues of child labor, I mean, they emanate from the US. They argue that if you've got an 8-year-old who says, I can work, and you've got an employer who says, actually, I've got work for you to do. Therefore, the government must not intervene and say, but that is going to be child labor. They should be left alone to do their own thing. So in that process, then they produce goods and services at a cheaper rate. And therefore, yes, you will buy more goods and services from there, but at the expense of the workers who are paid cheap. Now, the argument is that in poor countries, you've got the government that must look after the people. You've got strict basic conditions of employment, which will not allow an 8-year-old in any circumstance to be employed and be in the economic mainstream. And because of that, that cannot then mean that the US have got the highest standards of living. And secondly, because of the high immigrants in the UK, they tend to produce, because they are not protected, they tend to produce those goods and services at a cheaper rate. Number 11, the argument is that Africa is not destined for development. Now, the capitalists, they put arguments forward to say that Africa has got a bad climate, and with that climate, they are prone to tropical diseases. Africa has got a bad geography with most of its countries landlocked, and then Africa has got a bad culture. Africa doesn't have good quality institutions, and therefore most of African people are therefore uneducated, and Africa has got an abundance of natural resources, which then makes people poor, and hence you see people loitering in the streets. They come with all sorts of arguments to put forward and say that because of all these things, therefore Africa will not prosper. And they then say, Africa, we are more ethnic. We will fight with one another because we are more ethnic, and therefore we are unable to cooperate with one another. But the reality is that all those things that they put forward, like landlocked countries, the climate, we've got bad climate in rich countries. You can go up to -4 degrees for the whole week. So it's the same conditions that you have. You've got countries that are landlocked, even in rich countries. You've got a bad culture, even in the West culture, even in those rich countries. And those arguments cannot hold. The argument is that these rich countries, they want to come because they are darlings of international financial markets, which are prone to free market policies like your IMF and the World Bank. And therefore, they want to impose those policies on us through IMF and the World Bank. And therefore, Africa is unable to access resources, because when you want to access resources, they will tell you that you then need to adhere to the rules and conditions as set out by IMF and the World Bank, which will never see Africa going anywhere. So if we do away with the free market policies and we pave our own way, there will be massive industrialization in Africa, and they are scared, because if that happens, that is the end of the rich countries, and that is the end of Africa being seen to be on its knees and begging for survival from these rich countries. And number 12, the argument that government pick winners. The capitalists will argue that government does not have the mechanism to pick winners. I mean, they argue that firstly, they don't have the mechanism, but secondly, even if they were to pick, it will be people who are not driven by profit, but people who are driven by proximity to power. So in our term, like if they were to deploy anybody to any strategic sector, they do that because that person is driven by power and not by profit. But the reality is that government does pick winners. You don't need a government that picks, obviously, people who cannot drive, who are not in the driving force. You need government that has got a biting teeth, and government that is very decisive, and government that can say no to capitalism. So the argument cannot be that the government cannot pick winners. Government can pick winners if they are willing to do so. So it starts with political willingness for government to pick winners and to pick winning solutions, and writing and making the right decisions at the right level. So that is what you need. Number 13, it says making people richer doesn't make all of us rich. So the rich, they say that because it is them, that's the capitalists. They say that because it is them that produces, and it is them that brings about job creation, and it's them that invent new technologies. Therefore, they must be left to do that on their own. Because if government then intervenes, they are going to lose the appetite to operate, and they will even threaten government to leave those countries. And therefore, they must be the ones. So their argument is that if you've got a pie worth 1,000 rands, as an example, you give 900 to the rich, and the poor, you give them 100. And then the argument is that the 900, which is owned by the rich, they will then double it. And when they double the pie to make it 1,800, the rich will then get 200. But the reality is that it doesn't do anything to the gap between the rich and the poor. So because they want to remain in control and they want to remain in charge, they want to bring about the trickle-down economy tactics, which have never worked anyway. So it must be rejected that they must be left alone, and they must not be even guided or regulated in any way. Number 14 says the US managers are overpriced. Now, the capitalists, they argue that the argument that the US managers are overpriced cannot stand, because people get paid according to productivity, and therefore for you to attract and retain talent, you therefore need to pay more money to keep those individuals, irrespective of whether that is like really peeing on the face of the poor. I mean, imagine a CEO who's earning 9 million rands a year, and a workshop worker who is drilling and working and producing products earning 200,000 per year. So there's no justification, but the capitalists will tell you that irrespective of that, leave us as the capitalists, because we attracted that talent, and that talent is going to be the one to drive that 200,000 paid employee to produce more. But the reality is that most of the CEOs currently, as it stands right now, they are earning in relation to their counterparts in other countries. They are earning far much more, that's one. But also in relation to their predecessors, they They are earning far much more than their predecessors were earning back in the days. And currently and recently, there's no consequence management. These CEOs can just run the countries, the companies to the ground, and there's no one who will measure their performance and say, actually, you are killing this company, and therefore this is what needs to happen. I mean, you've got even here in the country, a bad performing CEO who's been removed and sent somewhere else. So that is the nature of capitalism, and that's how it works. It rewards people who are not working purely because they agree with what you want to push. Number 15, they argue that people in poor countries are not entrepreneurial. And the capitalists, they are saying people in poor countries, they loiter the streets, they don't know what to do, and if anybody has to be productive, then they need to stop loitering and change their attitudes and become and look for new ways of money-making profit opportunities out there. But the reality is that it's not about the individual ability to, I mean, poor people, poor countries, the first thing that you do when you wake up in the morning, when you don't have a salary, is you've got to make means to survive. So our entrepreneurial skills and the energy starts from survival. I don't know what I'm going to get the food in the next 8 hours. Therefore, I need to wake up and do anything. That is why you find people at the airport shining shoes of the rich just to get an incentive so that they can put bread on the table. That is one. And people that are said to be littering on the streets, those are our mothers and brothers and fathers who are trying to make ends meet by selling cigarettes, magwinya, fruits and vegetables just to keep the family alive. So it is not true that people are lazy and therefore people cannot work. Poor people from poor countries, they are more entrepreneurial than in the rich countries. The only thing is that capital will not allow you and will not agree to you coming and wanting to tap your hand into the same thing that made them to be rich. The first thing that will block you is the banks. The banks, if you go and approach the bank today, the bank will be very happy to approve your loan to finance a car. But the bank will never agree to give you money to start your own business. They will be telling you that you don't have experience, you don't have the know-how, therefore we cannot give you money to start your own business. But they will be happy to indebt you so that you're 100% on your knees begging for the next 5 years for them to finance your car. And if you buy revolutionary things like property, they will be saying to you, no, but we don't know you. You don't have a clothing account that can show that you are a good payer. And because you're not a good payer, we therefore can't finance your house. So they will come up with everything to block you from prospering and from wanting to see you grow. So it is not true that we are not entrepreneurial. We are entrepreneurial. The only thing that we need is a government that is going to be very decisive and get and organize these individual entrepreneurial skills and energies into a formed industry that is high in productivity. So the government needs to tap in and say, I've got a lot of youth who are unemployed, who have done carpentry, for example, and therefore I'm going to open a factory for them to be able to produce furniture. And until that happens, you will continue to remain poor, and that is what capitalism wants you to do. Number 16, as I move, I see that time is not on our side. Number 16, the argument that we are not smart enough to leave the market alone. We are told that markets, they are the only ones who knows what they are doing, and therefore they must not be in any way regulated. They must be self-regulatory. They must decide what they want to do. The government cannot tell them that, no, this you can do, this you cannot do. So we'll find a situation where companies will come into our country and start training a military force. And therefore we are, because it's a capital that dictates that must happen, we are therefore told that we need to leave that. So we're saying we can't have maximum freedom of choice of what we need to do, because we're going to bring dangerous things. You're going to start manufacturing weapons without a license here. You're going to start operating dangerous things that are going to put all our lives in danger. And therefore, it is government that must then decide this operation is allowed and the license must then be given. Number 17, it argues that more education is needed for you to run the successful economic development, and without education, because most of these government officials are not educated, they must stay away and live complicated policies like the free market, the socialism policy and communism. They must stick to limited and easy to deal with policies like the free market policies. But the reality is that there's little evidence showing that there's a direct relationship between education and prosperity. I mean, you've got grade 2 who are more richer than doctors. You've got doctors who are driving taxis. You've got engineers who are domestic workers. So you've got masters of business leadership, MBL graduates who are cleaners. So it is not a direct link. There's no direct link. What needs to happen is that government then needs to come in, and we all agree we need education. That goes without saying. But education without the industries, you are going to have doctors who are domestic workers. And therefore, education alone cannot bring about the prosperity. For you to be a wealthy country, for you to become a rich country, you then need to industrialize. And more industry will make the economy to grow. Number 18, the argument is that General Motors is not good enough for the national economy. Here the capitalists are arguing that the corporate sector is at the heart of the capitalism system. And therefore, if you put the corporate sector at the heart, which is what they believe the capitalists is, that they will grow because they know they've got the expertise, they know what to do. They cannot be told to do things that they don't want to do. They must be left to do what they want to do. But the reality of the matter is that if the corporate sector was to be left alone and not be regulated, you are going to have the same situation that you are having right now of lily mine workers who were trapped under the ground for many years and nobody is being held accountable. So you will have situations like Matakana where the people were killed and years later there's no one who's in jail. And that is how capitalism works. They want us to agree that those forms of cruelty must be allowed to happen. Kill people in Matakana because they don't want to work. You must force them to go and work irrespective of the conditions, whether you are paying them or not. They must continue to be slaves and work and produce for the capitalists. But the reality is that if government does not regulate, but not only regulate and make sure that these companies conform to this regulation. So it's about creating regulations. It's not about the quantity of the regulations, but it's about the quality of the regulation. But most importantly, the implementation of those policies. So if the policy says you can't walk into a workshop without a hard head, and then people work in the workshop are forced to work in the workshop without a hard head by capitalists, and there's no punishment for these companies, they will just continue. I mean, if you're forced to work on heights and government says no one is allowed to work on heights without harnesses, and yet there are companies that are forcing employees to work on heights without harnesses and they fall and die and government doesn't do anything about it. That is where the problem is. So we need a government that's got a biting teeth. We need a government that will regulate, but most importantly, then implement those regulations and put harsh punishments to those people who are not adhering to the regulations. And number 19, they say, despite the fall of communism, we still live in a planned economy. So they want us to believe that it is only in socialism and communism where there's a lot of planning that goes into place, and therefore planning is undesirable for the economy, and planning is not possible in an ever-changing world. That is what the capitalists, they want us to believe. But the reality is that even the capitalists themselves, they plan, because they plan to block you from accessing finances. I mean, think about the paper that you fill in when you want to go and apply for a loan. There's hundreds and hundreds of questions that they ask you. They're not asking you because they're interested in knowing you. They're asking you because they want to find a way to block you from accessing that facility. But secondly, you need to plan, because most of the what governments needs to do is to put about a long-term planning, so long-term investment that is going to sustain the economy for a very long time. You can't wake up and not plan and just say, I'm going to open a city, like the president of the country who just woke up and said, we're going to build a city. How are you going to build a city? So you need to plan and put thorough planning into what exactly do you want to do. It can't be random. You wake up and say you're going to build a city. Tomorrow you wake up and say you are going to build a bullet train. So it's directionless. You do it a structured way of approaching and in creating a good and a sustainable economy. Number 20, it says equal opportunity. So this one says many people are fighting. This is the capitalist telling us that many people are fighting because of inequality. When you reward people who are hardworking and who put more effort, people must not complain, because if you don't do that, then there's two things that's going to happen. You're going to demoralize those hardworking people. They will stop working very hard. But secondly, you are losing the incentive of getting and retaining good talent. And therefore it is, even if it's unjust in terms of the salary gaps and salary differences, you must just give them those salaries. But secondly, then he makes an example with the white school issue in South Africa that happened during apartheid, and says during apartheid in South Africa, black kids were not allowed to go to white school, the perceived white performing schools, particularly in the higher education. And therefore, although it was an injustice, which capitalists will agree that it was an injustice, then they argue and say, but then you can't open the gates for all black kids. So you must just put an equal opportunity, and that's where it ends. Because you will, if you open for everybody, then you run a risk of attracting people who are less competent. But the reality is that if there's equal opportunity, which we all agree that that's the beginning of creating a fair society, but if that equal opportunity is not coupled with equal conditions, then you're going to find most people or kids coming from poor families not be able to concentrate in class, not because they are incompetent, but because this child woke up in the morning on an empty stomach and has to go to class and sit next to a person coming from a rich family who had just had a nice fat breakfast, and they must all perform the same. So the equal opportunity is the beginning of the fair society, we agree, but it must be coupled with bringing about some equal conditions. For example, that child who's having an empty stomach in class, give that child food. If that child has got is living in a child-headed family, create support structure for that child so that the child does not become a mother or a father at the age of 12 and still be forced to sit in class and concentrate. But thirdly, give that child study material. And then once you've got the child who's got food, both at home and at school, and they've got the study material, and they've got the same support structure like the child who comes from a rich family, then you can then say, I have done something. I have created equal opportunity, but at the same time, I've addressed socioeconomic conditions so that there's fair competition across everybody. Number 21 says the big government makes people open to change. And the capitalists, they want to argue that big governments are bad for the economy when the rich are taxed and their money goes to unemployment insurance fund and healthcare and welfare system. It makes people to be lazy and not want to go to work. And therefore, you need to then create small governments that are manageable and will not be forcing rich people to pay a lot of money. Now ask yourself, this directly speaks to why Africa was divided into 54 countries. It's precisely so that it becomes manageable. And when we talk about open borders and one Africa, this is a typical example of how the capitalists want to manage. The capitalists divided us into various countries so that each country can look at its small resource and focus on its small population. And in most cases, then the capitalists will come and take over, like we see happening in Africa. Ask yourself why they are the ones who, for the loudest voice, to oppose the notion that we need one Africa, we need one president, we need one economy, we need one currency in Africa. It's precisely because they know that if you've got a big government with all the natural resources that we have in the continent, with all the expertise that we have in the continent, with everything that we have in the continent, we will be able to run successful economies. And therefore, this is the time where we need to rally behind each other as Africans and say, let's drive one Africa, one president, one currency, and one economy. And we will see the rich countries starting to behave. Now, the 22nd issue that they're bringing on the table is the financial markets needs to become less competent and not more competent. Now, the capitalists, they will argue that they've got innovations. They brought about innovations that makes the financial market to be a very good market. And therefore, because of that, is thriving. The market is flourishing because the free market policies, they brought about innovation. But they forget that the 2008 financial crisis was brought about the same innovations. That collapsed the whole system. I mean, the crash that happened in 1929, the Great Depression, was because of those innovations. So the reality is that the markets, because of they're driven by capitalism, they are volatile, and they make it difficult for the property sector to then plan long-term planning, because the property sector is one of the sectors that have got a long-term planning. You don't buy a house to live in it for 5 years. A house can last, I mean, there are buildings that have lasted more than 150 years. So the gap between the financial market and the property sector needs to be shortened, needs to be closed down, so that the governments can then plan on long-term planning, and they don't have a fear of these innovations that are brought about by capitalism that can just crash the market. I mean, you can buy a house today. If the market crashes today, that house that you bought for 2 million rands, it can be worth 500,000, and you've lost, because you'll be sitting with a loan at the bank that is worth 2 million on a house that is worth 5 million. And therefore, we need to then deliberately make these financial markets more less efficient than the capitalists, they will say. And the last thing that Professor Chang talks about is the good economic policy that does not require good economists. So the capitalists will argue and say that for you to run a successful economic system, you need good economists. And because, once again, the majority of the lawmakers who are officials, government officials, and members of parliament and members of provincial legislatures, they are not educated, they don't have the know-how, they have not been trained on economics, and therefore they cannot talk about complex matters like socialism, pushing socialism policies, and pushing policies that are pro-poor. And therefore, we must stick to less complicated policies like the free market. But the reality is that there are economic policies that were run in other countries, very rich countries, that are not run by economists. If you take China, for example, China, for the longest time, the economic policies were run by engineers. And till today, they're doing very well. If you look at Switzerland and Japan, and to a lesser extent, Korea, those policies were run by the lawyers who are not necessarily competent in economics. So therefore, the notion that you need economists to run the country must be rejected. The notion should be that you need a government that is very decisive in terms of putting the policies forward and implementing those policies. And how you see that the policy has not worked, the capitalism has not worked. Take a typical example with South Africa. 25 years into democracy, we've been on a capitalist system. And what we see year on year is the slower growth of the economy, if any. and is a high levels of inequality and the heightened levels of instability in the country. So let's all agree that for 25 years, after democracy, after the dawn of democracy, we have not seen any growth in the country because of the system. And therefore, it is time to change the economic system of the country and move into pro-poor policies that will see the growth of the economy. Now, in conclusion, the question is, what is to be done? With all this being said and done, what do we need to do? We need government that has got a biting teeth. We need government that is very decisive. We need government that is going to bring about the better welfare system. We need government that is going to bring about the better regulatory system. We need a government that is going to bring about the better industrial policy. So for you to grow the economy of any country, the country must industrialize. So industrialize, industrialize, and industrialize. Without industry, we will not grow any economy, and you will not have any sustainable economy. Now, what do you do when you industrialize? It's very simple. You build factories. Now, you can't build a factory in the air. You can't build a factory nowhere. For you to build a factory, you need the land. And therefore, the first thing that you need to do is expropriation of land without compensation. And in South Africa, there are two things that you must do with the land. The one thing is to redistribute it, to address the injustices of the past. The land was taken by Jan van Riebeeck and his fellows when they arrived here. Well, documented 1652, could have been earlier than that. And until we take that land back, there's nothing you can do. We are going to dilly-date about anything else, because everything else that you build, the foundation is the land. Without the land, there's nothing that you can do. So you take back the land. The EFF will take back the land when you take over this government, and we will redistribute it to its rightful owners so that the people can build their own houses. Right now in South Africa, government, and we will redistribute it to its rightful owners so that the people can build their own houses. Right now in South Africa, if you want to buy a house in some of these upmarket estates, and you want to build your own, you don't want to buy an existing, you start by buying the land. And the property sector people, they will tell you that that land will cost you no less than 500,000. Now, a 500,000 rent land, that's a complete finished house. So before you even put one brick, you already have 500,000 gone. When if you were anywhere else, you would have built a house completely. So the land must belong to the state, and the state must redistribute the land for equally to everybody. Number two, the land must then, the state must then start to industrialize. I mean, let's take for an example Gauteng province. So Gauteng was made rich by its mineral called gold. If you don't know, Gauteng means the place of gold. So Gauteng is made what it is because of gold. Now, this gold was not beneficiated here in the country. This gold was extracted from this area to various parts of the world. Now, can you imagine if that gold was beneficiated here in South Africa? Not necessarily in Gauteng. Take that gold, go and beneficiate it in Eastern Cape and see what it will do to the economy of Edudwa. So the capitalists will not want to do that. Going back to the issue of now multinational companies, they will not want to do that, because once you do that, that's productivity, that's economic activity. You are then putting a lot of people under employment, and when we've got more people employed, that automatically leads to the growth of the economy, and therefore they would not want to. So I want everybody to imagine South Africa if the gold that was extracted from Gauteng was beneficiated here in the country. Currently, we are extracting iron ore from Northern Cape being shipped out in Western Cape in Saldanha. The state-owned entity called Transnet is moving iron ore in a train that is 4 kilometers long, 342 wagons, 6 locomotives, 1 driver, 1 assistant. Every day, they move that train 4 to 8 times a day. Now, can you imagine that magnitude of iron ore being shipped out of the country? And where is it going? It's going to the countries that are beneficiating it. Majority of those countries are rich. Now, imagine if we were to beneficiate that mineral here in the country. We will not be importing steel from China. We will be having a strong, very strong government-owned entity that is a steel company, the same way we used to have back the ISCO of our time. So we need to beneficiate. But first thing you need to do is to take back the land with its sea and the air, and then you will be able to push most of these activities. Now, the second thing that you need to do is to nationalize the mines, the banks, and other sectors of the economy. I've already spoken about the minerals, so I'm going to go into the banks. Currently, when the Minister of Finance takes the podium and say the budget for this year is 3 trillion, ask yourself, where is that money sitting? And because there's a plan of how the government is going to spend that money, these capitalists in the form of banks, they take that money, they invest it, because they know that for the first 3 months, government will need this much, and then the next 3 months, this much, and this much, and this much. So anything that is beyond the 3 months or the 6 months, they will go and invest it and create profit for themselves. If government was owning the bank and they take that money and put it in the bank, and that money generate interest, that interest you'll have when you put 3 trillion rand, imagine that interest, how much it will be in 6 months. Now, the capitalists will not allow you to do that because you are taking the food from their mouth. They will do everything to block you from doing exactly that. Now, and the third issue is, why are we not owning Sasol? Sasol is one of the strategic sectors that drives the economy. Why are we not owning Sasol? Why was Sasol taken from being state-owned on the dawn of democracy and made it to be a private? Because the capitalists, they know that with this they are going to prosper. But then again, ask yourself, with the small state-owned entities that we have, why are they keen to buy SAA? If it's true that SAA is not performing and has not been performing for the longest time, why are capitalists waiting to buy SAA? Why are they buying an entity that is not performing? It's because it's artificial, this performance. They are putting to us an artificial performance that they want us all to believe that no, SAA is not performing, SAA is taking money from you, and then you must sell it off. They are doing the same with Eskom. They want to run down Eskom. They've started now with wanting to divide Eskom. And furthermore, they are starting with wanting to generate their own energy. And we must reject that. They will come to Transnet very soon. I mean, they've already started with Transnet as well. The sitting president of South Africa went to open a Gibela, which is a direct competitor to a Transnet operating division, the only manufacturing division of Transnet that can produce locomotives and coaches and wagons. Now, why would he go and open a private entity to compete against his own state-owned entity, so that they can run down the state-owned entity and then they can sell it off and they can take over as a private? And sadly, he does this to the key strategic sectors that are meant to champion the liberation of Africa. I mean, Transnet, with all its resources and the assets and the experience, they were ready to champion the railway across the continent. But of course, if you've got a government that doesn't believe in that, then you're going to see exactly what is happening. So you need to nationalize the mines, the banks, and other strategic sectors of the economy. Things like the pharmaceutical company. We must be told what is happening with the pharmaceutical industry. We must be told why is public works, as an example. Public works in the past, they used to build offices and build roads. But today, the same people that are there to facilitate and push paper. Their job is to go out on tender. And I can tell you now, you will find that most of even their specifications are not even written by them. They are written by private people who are going to then tender for the same job. So we need a public works that is able to build houses and that is able to build roads, so that we don't go and get private people to build roads. That's now the third point of saying we need to build state capacity. We need state capacity. We need to have our own capacity. Don't go and on tender to buy a tissue. That's what we are being reduced to with this current government. So build state capacity that will lead to the abolishment of tenders, so that the focus is really on driving. You are not going to industrialize if you are going to continue being a paper pusher. You're pushing paper. You went to the school as an engineer, and you come back and you are employed by the state as a public works official, and all that you do is to take tenders and to give them to the same people that went to school with you for them to come and build the roads for you. So you're wasting taxpayers' money because you are just a paper pusher. You can't even manage that project. You rely on these service providers to create employment. Now, the fourth thing is we need free quality education and a free sanitation, free houses, and free health care. Now, without a solid welfare system, you will not be able to defeat and to grow the economy. That's why today we are all worried, because the healthcare system in the country has collapsed. And now with the coronavirus, on a collapsed healthcare system, we must all pray. The government, they've got no clue on what to do. They can't even nationalize the private hospitals to date, even when they can see that the lives of people are at danger. We've seen countries who've already came forward and agreed that socialism is the way to go by nationalizing the private hospitals. But the current sitting president, when you say let's nationalize the hospital, he will laugh at you like he did when a leader of the revolution was giving a clear direction on what needs to happen. It's because he's presiding over government that he's got no control of. He gets told by the capital that, chief, we don't have money. We can close this firms and go. And if we close the firms, it's a danger, because the current government rely on taxes. So if they close these factories with the government that is not able to generate its own revenue except for facilitating and taking over taxes, then we must all be worried, because everybody in government, they must show us one single entity that they've created, or an industry that is high in productivity that they've created that will be able to sustain the country. There's none. We should all be worried, because if everything else closes, the government will not have income, because government is dependent on taxes to keep moving. Now, the fifth thing is we need to have massive protected industrial development to create millions of jobs. And I've emphasized this point quite a lot, to say you can never look at Singapore, look at Japan. You can never ever compete with those countries because they are very high in industrial development, and they look at industries that produce a lot of products. Therefore, you ought to industrialize and you ought to build industries, and that will then lead to the massive development of the African economy. And we must stop from advocating for reconciliation and go for taking back what belongs to you. The injustices of the past, they must be addressed, and we must move towards the massive industrialization and massive development of the African economy. And lastly, we need to have an open, accountable, and free corrupt government. Once we have all these 7 key things that I've highlighted, you've industrialized, you've got a corrupt-free government, you've got corrupt-free society, you will see the economy growing. Now, in closing, Prof closes by saying that if we don't abandon the things that we did in the past that made the economy not to grow, and they continue not making the economy to grow, and we still continue with those things and hoping that in the future the economy will grow, we would have done nothing. We would have been a generation that came in and been counted and went back without fighting any injustices and without really putting any effort in alleviating the poverty and insecurity of billions of our people. So therefore, this is the time that we need to get uncomfortable. And the time is now. The time is now for us to see the injustices of the past. The time is now for us to see the brutality of the capital system. The time is now for us to roll our sleeves, ladies and gentlemen, and saying we are going to fight against this unjust system. And the only system that will take us from where we are right now into a greater future is socialism. With that being said, I hope that you've enjoyed this session. Continue to read the book, continue to send your comments, continue to engage. We'll be doing the next book again in 3 days, which will be led by Komisa Pioba. And until then, please remain safe. Please adhere to the rules and regulations of the lockdown. Stay at home. Don't become a statistic. We want to see you again in the future, healthy and strong. We are going to build a strong economy. We are here to make a change, and let us all be counted. Let us go forward with one Africa, one economy, one currency, and one president. I thank you very much.